Hey, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from, and welcome. I'm Anik Fibri, a co-founder of Better Trade Collective. At Better Trade, we work with governments and companies on forced labor trade enforcement. My business partner, Marcia Eugenio, and I founded it after previously serving in the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, where we built and implemented these systems from the US government side. Marcia was scheduled to moderate today. She sends her regrets that she's not feeling well, unfortunately. USTR Section 301 forced labor investigations are sending a clear signal. Trading partners are expected to have credible operational frameworks for forced labor trade enforcement, not just policies on paper. For governments in the room, that expectation is often arriving ahead of the technical capacity and institutional infrastructure needed to meet it. For companies, it's raising questions about what their trading partners' enforcement gaps mean for their own supply chain exposure. The US has been building its forced labor import prohibition system for decades, and it remains a work in progress. What that experience offers is not a perfect model to replicate, but lessons about what works, what doesn't, what the gaps look like from the inside. Today's panel brings together people who built, enforced, and navigated these systems firsthand, from the trade side at USTR, from customs enforcement at CBP, from the labor and supply chain due diligence side, and from the private sector experience of actually going through remediation. Our goal is to give you frameworks you can apply in your own context, whether you're designing investigative capacity, building customs enforcement systems, engaging with industry, or responding to a US trade action. We have a few questions to start and have reserved time for open Q&A. Please feel free to share your questions in the chat at any point, and we'll get to them shortly here. So with that, let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Josh Kagan, who's an international trade attorney at Kelly, Dry and Warren, advising clients on UFLPA compliance, CBP detentions, and Section 307 petitions. He previously led USTR's Labor Office as Assistant US Trade Representative for Labor Affairs, and also served as Deputy Director in the Bureau of International Labor Affairs Office of Trade and Labor Affairs, giving him a firsthand view of these enforcement systems from both the trade and labor sides. Next, Jen Yonke is the founder and executive director of the Tendai Initiative. She previously worked for CBP's Forced Labor Division and now supports forced labor import prohibition implementation as a government contractor. She also advises private sector clients on preventing, identifying, and remediating forced labor in global supply chains. She knows what it takes to move from policy to enforcement in practice. And Michael Pennant-Jones has over 25 years experience advising companies on business and human rights. He led the remediation strategy for Sime Darby plantations that supported CBP's modification of its withhold release order. Few withhold release orders have been modified so far. Michael's been through that process and can speak to what CBP actually needs to see. So with that, let's turn to the questions. And let's start with Josh. What are the implications of the current Section 301 investigations for countries and the private sector?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. Happy to join this. This is a great panel. I'm really happy to be a part of the conversation. Maybe I could just start with a little brief background on what Section 301 is and how we ended up here. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 is a fairly well-established provision in US law. I say that at the outset because the ability of the executive to issue tariffs under Section 301 is much better established than under the previous authorities used by the Trump administration for the global tariffs, at least. So those are IEEPA and Section 122. Neither of those had been used in this way before. And certainly the use of Section 301 here is novel in terms of the scope of focusing on 60 economies at the same time, but its use is not novel. It was used by President Trump in his first term, used by President Biden as well, for a variety of issues. So it's a fairly well-established basis to impose tariffs. That basis has two prongs. It allows imposition of tariffs against foreign countries that, one, engage in acts, policies, or practices that are unjustifiable, unreasonable, or discriminatory. The unreasonable provision there is the relevant one here. And then two, burden or restrict US commerce. The definition of unreasonable in the statute specifically includes a persistent pattern of conduct that permits any form of forced or compulsory labor. So that's the general basis of that first prong. USTR is saying it is unreasonable that other countries do not have a forced labor import prohibition to try and stop forced labor goods from entering their markets. And by doing that, it is negatively impacting, burden or restricting US commerce to the extent that U.S. goods are forced to compete against goods from other countries that might have forced labor inputs, and countries are not effectively addressing that issue. Essentially, a comparative advantage argument. It's not the first time. This is something I think has gotten lost in some of the analysis. It's not a new issue for the U.S. government. I mean, obviously, the folks on this panel have a lot of experience implementing forced labor import prohibitions in the U.S. context, or working on due diligence issues associated with that and remediation of those issues. But the U.S. government has been asking other countries to implement forced labor import prohibition in the context of trade negotiations for at least the last 15 years, going back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. And my experience, every negotiation since. And so, other than Mexico and Canada, who did agree to implement a forced labor import prohibition in the USMCA, the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, every other country said no. And so, I think there's a conversation about, is this pretext? Is this legitimate? My personal view is two things can be true. It is both an effort to rebuild the tariff wall, and also it is a legitimate concern by the U.S. government. So that this investigation has resulted in provisional rates that were announced, and those are a 10% countrywide tariff for countries who have implemented but not enforced a forced labor import prohibition, and so that's Mexico and Canada, have committed to implement a forced labor import prohibition. Either the EU with its well discussed forced labor regulation supposed to come online into next year, and also countries who have just made that commitment bilaterally to the United States in the context of the negotiations that have been happening over the last year with the Trump administration. And then, maybe a topic for another day, the UK gets thrown in there too. And so they all get 10%. And that's 14. The other 46 economies get a 12.5% countrywide tariff. There are a number of exceptions. There is an Annex A list of goods that are excluded from the scope of the countrywide tariffs. These are largely consistent with the exceptions that existed under the two previous tariff regimes implemented by the Trump administration. And generally cover things that are not produced in the United States, kind of basket goods that I think the administration feels like relate to affordability issues. And then there are also exclusions for USMCA qualifying goods that are subject to the sector-specific Section 232 tariffs, CAFTA textile qualifying provision goods rather. But on a general scale, they are countrywide. And so USTR is currently requesting public comments on these tariffs, and there are a number of specific questions they're asking for. The deadline to provide that input is July 6th. And so it is a chance for folks to weigh in on the tariff rates, the countries that are covered, whether some countries that are receiving the 10% should be in the 12.5% because they're not really going to implement it, or they haven't really taken any effective steps, or the other way around, if a country really is wholeheartedly trying to address the issue and they should be in the 10% group. There's also a chance to weigh in on the scope of that Annex A and what goods should or should not be subject to the tariffs on a global basis. There are not country-specific exceptions, but global. And then basically USTR has teed up this process. I can't guarantee they'll play out this way, but they've teed up this process to have these final tariffs for this investigation in place by July 24th, when the current Section 122 tariffs expire. So that's kind of the background. And I think what it is doing is pushing a number of countries to seek to lower their tariff rate under this investigation by implementing or taking steps to implement and potentially even subsequently enforcing a forced labor import prohibition. So I think we've seen, a couple of countries already enact laws. We've seen Canada propose a much stronger version of their current import prohibition. I've seen Brazil having some real conversations about this in terms in their legislative system. So I think there is a lot of movement in this space, and I think the rubber will hit the road to some extent when we see what enforcement looks like. Once countries start actually stopping shipments and enforcing forced labor import prohibitions, will their tariff rate under this investigation go down? Will it go below 10%? Will it go to 0? Will it go to 5? Will they be somehow economically incentivized to stop forced labor goods at the border? And I think if that happens, I would expect to see a floodgate of other countries doing the same thing. So I think the question for countries right now is, what does it take to lower that tariff rate? And do you think the United States will follow through on rewarding you if you stop shipments? I think those are reasonable questions that I would be asking. And like I said, we've already seen some early breakers moving in that direction. Tariffs in 2026 are not about trying to get back to the most favored nation rate or trying to have 0% tariffs. That world is gone, and probably gone no matter what happens in the US in 2 years in terms of the elections. The question now is what tariff rate are countries receiving compared to the countries they view as their competitors? It's all about comparative advantage. So if you are India, you certainly want the lowest rate possible, but you really want your rate to be lower than Vietnam, say, China, whoever you view as your strategic competitor from a production standpoint. So whatever countries can do to lower those rates, I think they would be wise to do it. There are also multiple other investigations coming under Section 301. We're focused on forced labor here, rightly so. But there are other broad investigations, including multiple economies at a time. There are country-specific investigations, and we've heard from USTR and the White House there are more coming, maybe after the midterms, but there are more coming. And so the expectation is the tariffs imposed under these various 301 investigations will stack on top of each other, and that will be the aggregate rate that a country receives. So I wouldn't expect at the end of the day that the countries who have 10% right now end with 10%. They might have 18, they might have 25. It might be about what they got under IEEPA, but it might be different. And it might be higher to try and incentivize them back to the negotiating table to conclude some of those bilateral agreements with the Trump administration. So I mention this because at the end of the day, if the issues you have to face as a country are implementing and enforcing a forced labor import prohibition, overhauling your domestic production system to address overcapacity, completely changing your intellectual property system in a meaningful way, I think this might end up being the thing that countries can actually do the most easily. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of action in this space as countries try to get a comparative advantage, lower that 10 or 12.5% rate vis-a-vis their competitors. From a company standpoint, for the private sector, I think you should be preparing for a world where the traceability, due diligence, and remediation expectations that currently exist for sales into the US market exist on a much broader basis. I mean, we very well could be talking about a world where you have to have those same expectations and you have to have those same supply chain due diligence no matter where you're selling in the world, not just in the US. And so I think it behooves companies to start thinking about that now and making sure that they have as much visibility into their upstream supply chain and the labor practices involved in that as possible. Better to do it now than to do it when there's an actual detention and you're on the clock. And, I think right now, one of the issues that we see is fairly common practice that goods, if they are detained by CBP under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930, they're often re-exported, right? But in a world where there are 59 other forced labor import prohibitions, where are you going to send them? So I think for the private sector, now's the time to get on top of this. Know your upstream supply chain, know the labor rights and labor practices happening in it, do your due diligence, and try and address issues and choose suppliers before you have enforcement problems.
Josh, thank you so much for outlining the process and raising the questions that we still need to see answered. I think also really outlining what's at stake here, both for countries and for companies. And that raises the practical question, what does it actually take to build the investigative and customs capacity that would be considered credible? And so for both Jen and Josh, what should countries consider as they build their forced labor investigative capacity and also their customs enforcement systems? Jen, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to co-host this on behalf of the Tendai Initiative. I'm so pleased to work with the Better Trade Collective, and it's a pleasure to be here. So we're looking at a situation unprecedented in the area of forced labor where countries are working very quickly to try and put forced labor import prohibitions in place. They are moving quickly in order to try and reduce the tariff level, as Josh was mentioning. But as they are moving forward, I'm trying to advise folks that you really need to try and balance this this rapid approach to putting a flip or forced labor import prohibition in place against the you have to try and balance that, because putting a flip in place really takes some consideration and thought in order to actually operationalize the program and the legal authority. So the first step is obviously trying to think about putting together a legal authority, the statutory language that's going to allow a country to prohibit items that are made with forced labor from entering their market. And as they consider this, they cannot just copy and paste the language from Section 307 and apply it to their own situation. And I don't think I'm saying anything that people don't already know. But there are so many more things that a country needs to consider. They need to look at their existing trade enforcement infrastructure and consider what legal authorities they need in order to actually operationalize this. So they need to ask questions such as, do we already have the ability to compel an importer to provide product level information about their supply chain? Can we compel them and require them to submit information about the supply chain all the way upstream supply chain, all the way to the raw material production? Or is it just tier one? Looking at these different requirements that are already in place in to support other trade enforcement prohibitions, that's going to be a key step to consider in the very beginning. So before you even introduce statutory language, my recommendation is to look at what is in your trade enforcement toolkit, what authorities you already have in place, and see where you need to fill the gaps, making sure that you have all the types of authorities to determine what happens when the shipments come in and they're prohibited. Are countries allowed to re-export? How do they? What are they allowed to? What are they allowed to do with the shipment? Things of that nature are going to be really important, that they're outlined either in the statutory language or in the regulations themselves. And so there's a two-part process here: trying to pass the law, getting operational regulations in place, trying to think about how this is going to take place in practice. What is enforcement going to look like? Making sure that you have all those legal authorities in place from the beginning is really going to be critical, because as we've seen in the Section 301 investigations, USTR is not only looking at whether countries have the statutory language in place, but also whether they're enforcing against it. And in order to reduce that tariff level and that percentage, making sure that this is actually something that you can act on is going to be critically important. Um, the second thing, as I've mentioned, it's critically important to leverage what you have, but to recognize that while you may have a prohibition that against any types of illegal drugs coming into the country, or you may have health and safety prohibitions or requirements. When you look at those prohibitions, there a lot of times what countries do is they'll inspect a shipment in order to determine if it is a prohibited good. But in this case, you have to really think about the fact that you can't inspect a shipment and on the face of it know, yes, this was made with forced labor. Instead, you have to think about what type of infrastructure you have in place to trace supply chains and to target shipments and to know which shipments are connected to forced labor conditions. So as you think through these different requirements, it's important to look at your country's capabilities in these areas. When I worked at CBP, that was a critical component of the work. I think people might be thinking very critically, and they should be, about how to identify forced labor, and that's certainly important. But if you think of this in a sequential order, you really need to be thinking about your customs infrastructure first, and then looking at how to build your forced labor import identification capabilities. They're both extremely important, but if you think about what you have to do first, looking at your customs infrastructures and capabilities is really key. I think the second thing you want to think about is how the actors are going to, the agencies with responsibilities under a flip are going to work together, and who will be involved in case management. This is a critical area of work because I think a lot of people, when they think about forced labor, they think about this in the context of labor rights, and they think about this within the context of social responsibility. And that is accurate. However, there's another component of this that focuses on law enforcement. So you need to think about what your law enforcement capabilities look like within the trade context. So if you have information from witnesses, sources, or workers, how is that information going to be kept safe? How is that information going to be kept confidential in order to ensure the safety of people involved in the investigation? That's going to be a key question. So that I would be asking, who's going to have access to information, and how is that going to be protected under your country's law enforcement sensitive or classification system? How is information kept classified? And how you think about how law enforcement interacts with trade policy is going to be key as you move forward. I've mentioned several times focus on customs, but I think if we look at the language from the agreements, the ART agreements, the agreements on reciprocal trade, it's very clear that USTR is looking for countries to recognize CBP's WROs, their trade enforcement action. That could be a WRO, that could be a finding, could even be civil penalties. But they're looking for some trade enforcement recognition pieces. And so as you think through what this is going to look like, a consideration that I would be thinking about is how would that be operationalized? How would you take a trade enforcement action that's issued by CBP and then take it and bring it into your own system and then act on it? And then how would you demonstrate that you have done so? What kind of transparency would you have in place to demonstrate what types of shipments have been detained, where they've come from, the value of the detention and the shipments, and where those shipments are being held, and what standard you're going to hold importers to in order to have the detention released. So if you think about the CBP process, there's two different ways. You can try to prove that forced labor is not present within the scope that's been announced in the trade enforcement action. So, for example, let's look at a historical WRO that's been issued by CBP. They've issued against a bicycle supplier in Southeast Asia. So let's say it named the company and it named the product that was being detained. If that company can demonstrate that they have verifiable evidence that forced labor is not in that supply chain, then they could, in the US system, request a revocation. In the more common approach, however, is that companies would remediate the conditions. They would provide verified evidence that they have done so from an independent third party, and then they would be able to have the trade enforcement action modified, and the goods would then enter the US commerce. Countries need to think about how they're going to operationalize that process and what standard they will hold companies to when they do so. I think I'll be interested to see how countries think about this and whether they'll be replicating the US system. My recommendation is do not try to recreate the wheel here. If countries are trying to put a flip in place quickly, then it's best to look at the practices that are in place that are working and the practices that haven't worked so well, and make sure you're not replicating practices that are essentially creating blockers to implementation and enforcement. That's going to be key. So trying to kind of sum things up, trying to put a forced labor import prohibition in place and yet adding those blockers, it's doing you no good. Making sure that you can enforce and operationalize these statutory requirements is going to be key. It really needs to be thought through from the beginning. You need to be thinking about what you can replicate from other experiences, things that you want to avoid putting into your statutory language that would end up being a blocker to implementation and enforcement. You want to consider what infrastructure you have in place and leverage that rather than trying to create something new from scratch. And you need to think about how you're going to trace and target supply chains. So happy to answer questions on this or discuss. I think everybody's probably going to ask, why didn't she talk about forced labor more? And really, it's because it's probably later on in the process, I hate to say. It's going to be really critical that you do so, but think about customs first, and then take that strategic approach to thinking through how you're going to enforce the forced labor, working on forced labor. All of that will follow.
Thanks, Jen. Josh, did you want to jump in on that, particularly on the trade side?
Sure. I think those are great points. I think I was gonna make the point about the agreements on reciprocal trade that Jen made, so fully endorse that and everything else she said. A few things I will add. I do think, as she said, the structure matters, right? So we have pretty limited data in this space so far, but I was part of the negotiations with Mexico and Canada under the USMCA on creating their forced labor import prohibitions, and was also part of monitoring their implementation of those commitments. And I think some lessons learned in that space for me were Canada's approach. So I think Jen is right that having the customs authorities play a key role here is really important. You should go with what works in your system, but I think having the customs authorities play that identification role is really important, because the way Canada did it is they have their labor authorities do the identification of forced labor and then communicate it to their customs authorities, and just frankly had less folks working on this issue and less resources dedicated to it than the United States has. And so because it isn't their customs authorities doing that initial analysis, it limited the ability of US CBP to share information directly with the customs authorities in Canada. So I think building your system in a way that allows for information flow with the US enforcement authorities in this space, I think, is a smart way to do it. There's also was a provision under the Mexican law, which they changed, which said, one of the first things they do when they receive a petition is they go right to the importer and they ask them, they give them a chance to defend themselves against all of the allegations, which in some contexts might make sense. But I think when you're talking about forced labor in your supply chain and marginalized communities, for the most part, like you need to be really careful about how you're handling that situation. And so I think there were some lessons learned in terms of the specific structures that were implemented and ways to improve them. And like I had mentioned earlier, we already see Canada moving to make improvements. We'll see if Mexico does anything similar. But I think that structure does matter, and I do think having your customs authorities play that initial role is really important, even if it is in consultation with your actual labor experts in your labor ministry or wherever else in your government. I also wanted to mention in the USTR report on this investigation that announced the determination and the proposed remedies that we've discussed. They actually cite to some work by Dr. Laura Murphy on what a good forced labor import prohibition needs, what needs to be effective, and she lays out 8 elements. And so, I think Dr. Murphy knows a lot about this space and is a leader in this field, but also USTR directly cites to her and names her in the footnote. So I think we should pay attention to that. I don't know if that means this is exactly what they will be looking for 100% of the time, but this seems to be what they're laying out as the standard they are expecting. So I'll just go through those real quick in case folks don't happen to scroll right to page 26 of the report. A statutory definition of forced labor grounded in international law, a designated enforcement authority, a public entity list, the use of a rebuttable presumption where the use of forced labor is established for a particular good. By the way, that's what Canada's law, Canada's new proposal, it's not a law yet, Canada's new proposal would do, not just in the way the UFLPA focuses on goods from China, but basically taking a list of goods and regions where they believe to be forced labor and requiring importers to disprove a presumption that those goods are made with forced labor. Clear evidentiary standards, ideally based on reasonable cause, a remediation requirement, an accessible reporting and allegation mechanism, and transparency and public disclosure. So those are the sorts of things that the US says they are looking for. We'll see, like I said before, kind of where the rubber hits the road on this, but that's what they say. And then the last point, I would caution against, similar to what Jen said, I would caution against just throwing something together to try and get from 12.5 to 10%, because the comparative advantage there is later is going to come when countries start enforcing their prohibitions, and you have to enforce, if you're a country, you have to enforce your prohibition too to get that new comparative advantage and lower rate than 10%. And as I said before, I think this will be one of the easier tariff scopes to make progress. Yes, you want to lower your tariff rate if you're a country, but I think in the back of maybe the front of many minds is they also don't want to get sued. They also want to have a credible system that they can defend when there are detentions. And so I think building a system that has the sort of elements that Jen is describing and that Dr. Murphy is describing, these are the things that will help you to have a solid evidentiary basis for your subsequent enforcement that will give you a better chance to withstand legal challenges.
Thank you, Josh. A lot to unpack from both of you there. Yeah, if you don't mind, before we move on to the next question, Josh, you mentioned when working with marginalized communities, we have to be really careful about information sharing. I think it's such an important point, and I know it was really challenging when the consumptive demand loophole closed about 10 years ago. It was really challenging for CBP to figure out how to manage those protections. Could you just say a little, I think it's such an important point and something that really has to be built in from the beginning. Can you say a little bit more about that? And maybe, Jen, I know you were at CBP in that time frame. You could jump in with how you all were able to navigate that.
Well, gosh, I feel like Jen should be making the point, but I'll just say briefly that I think, my experience is, and it's not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, the folks that are experiencing forced labor conditions under the ILO indicators, they are from marginalized groups, right? There are folks who they're in that involuntariness and menace of penalty situation, often because they don't have the ability to advocate and get out of it. So, often we're talking about migrants. It could be, often across borders, sometimes within a country, right? Sometimes there are just particular groups within a country that are, I'm just thinking of like Dalits in India who have less ability to, access safety measures and public services. So I think, it's not 100% of the time, but I think that is common. I mean, I would be remiss not to mention Uyghurs. That is commonly a dynamic, right, in these sorts of situations. And so I think, you can't be too cavalier with this sort of information. You need to be careful because the folks who could really get harmed are pretty easy to harm. And I think that would be one of the worst outcomes here would be if a country was trying to lower its tariff rates to appease a U.S. trade investigation and, marginalized communities and real people got hurt as a result of that. So I think, you got to balance both. It's a tough space, but I think being really careful with that information is super important.
I think those are all incredibly important points that Josh has raised. And at the Tendai Initiative, we think a lot about vulnerable groups and what makes them vulnerable to forced labor. So they would not be in this situation, to Josh's point, if they were able to advocate for themselves, if they weren't if they weren't experiencing some type of vulnerability that led to this point. So when I'm limited in what I can say about my experience at CBP, but what I can say is that as countries start thinking this through, I mentioned earlier that you should really be thinking about who has access to the information and how to set up a law enforcement approach to this, to investigating and looking at forced labor conditions. You have to think about also how you're going to interact with people, workers who have potentially experienced a traumatic event, where there's a high likelihood actually that they've experienced a traumatic event. And so what I would say is that as countries are thinking through how they're going to protect this information, they should really be keeping that to a group of people with need to know status. So what I mean by that is really that information should not be shared. Case information should not be shared widely throughout an interagency process. Instead, case information should be held by a select group of people who have a need to know for that information. And then they need to think about how the identities of those groups will be kept confidential and protected. They also need to think through what types of retaliation that sources of evidentiary sources may be subject to. That could include organizations, not just people. So really have to think through this piece of the process very carefully. On the other hand, when you have anyone who is engaging with workers that are at risk of forced labor or in confirmed conditions, you really need to make sure that those people who are interacting with those workers have trauma and training on how to engage with them in a trauma-informed manner. That's really key and something that countries need to pay a lot of attention to, because there is, like, to Josh's point, you can do harm in these interactions, and it's absolutely critical not to make the situation worse.
Thank you both so much. I think we could do a whole separate webinar on that. So I appreciate you making those points. I think a lot of what we heard from Josh and Jen prior to that about how to build these systems and making sure that countries are operationalizing those systems beyond just legal frameworks also really hammered home the point that it takes time. And so Michael, I want to turn to you because the private sector doesn't always have the luxury of waiting for governments to get this right. So when a company finds forced labor in its supply chain, what should it do?
Thank you for the invite, and really pleased I can contribute to this discussion. What I would say, first of all, is that we're seeing a significant change for companies in human rights. And we've had 20 odd years of voluntary standards. We're now moving into a very fast changing regulatory environment, and it's very different. It's going to be the biggest change for a long time in this sector. Now, what I'd go back to something Josh said a minute ago is what you're doing credible as a private sector. And if you find forced labor, I would ask a couple of questions. I think the first one I would ask is, were you prepared to find forced labor? Is your forced labor strategy in line with increasing regulatory change and expectations? Do you have a prevention strategy? If so, why did it fail to find it? Or do you need to put one in place first also? Now, when we talk about human rights, we often talk about very binary decisions. Was there forced labor? Was there not forced labor? How did it occur, etc.? We're talking about something that's about human behavior. It's about control. It's about money, often, forced labor. It's about people changing behaviors to get advantage on two different fronts. So it's a constantly evolving. So it doesn't mean if you've got a strong preventative approach, sometimes it will fail because you're up against somebody that's trying to get around you continually. But if you've got a good preventative approach, generally it's much more effective, stopping forced labor. It's less costly than reacting later. But it cannot eliminate risk completely on forced labor. To me, this prevention piece is something companies should really take seriously because this is going to be a really important part of having a credible program in place and as a component of rebuttable presumption. You know, are your suppliers aware? Do they understand? Do they know what risks they have in their own operations? Have they got controls in place? Have they been trained? Have they got capacity, capability, etc.? Second part is due diligence. I think all companies should sit back and ask whether their due diligence system is designed to find and understand forced labor risk, or is it to demonstrate compliance? You know, I talk to a lot of companies, and some of them will say, and this goes from board level down, we want to understand the forced labor risks in our supply chain and what it looks like and what the potential impacts we have. Others will say, we want 100% compliance with no forced labor. Now, the outcomes for both those decisions are very different, especially at board or higher up levels. One is saying, what's the understanding of forced labor risk? Where is it occurring and what's our exposure? The other one says, I want compliance. So one is going to get a paper explaining that risk. Another is going to get a number. So we've got two different sets. Now, if you talk to the most progressive companies, they've got very dynamic risk processes involving country studies, sector studies, in-field understanding, worker voice, talking to CSOs, media. So they've got a very layered approach. It's constantly evolving. And they understand where the potential risks are, which aligns with regulatory as well. So it's all about risk. When they look at assessing a supplier, they will then look at risk and impact. If you're on the more compliance side, they're generally very poor tools for using subjective ILO indicators. And most companies I talk to will say we never find forced labor, even though they know it exists, because it's the wrong tool. They don't look at likelihood. They don't look at the preponderance of evidence. They look at a compliance level. So it's a very different approach. They're reactive. They're very much used with plausible deniability. For the producers or the ones at the bottom, what they do, and I found this very much with people like Simon Darby and lots of others, they get a shock when they get pulled up because every audit that's been through them, and they get a lot, has said, hey, you're fantastic. You're fine. No problem here. Then somebody comes up with a different methodology looking at risk and impact and says, actually, we think you have got forced labor. So we're creating this kind of emperor has no clothes by following this compliance approach when regulatory is looking at it very differently. And actually, if we look at guidelines like the OECD, etc., they all go about risk and impact. Yet we've got an industry that kind of cherry picks selections from it and say, oh, we're following OECD and we're doing compliance audits. That's not what it says. It's looking at risk and impact. So I would ask, have you got the right due diligence system in place? Are you asking the right questions of your supply chain? The third is, if you find forced labor, act quickly, stop harm, and try and remedy the situation. The problems with a compliance approach is you don't tend to have the knowledge to be able to interact very quickly. You've got a couple of lines that said, we've got forced labor. Well, that doesn't tell me much for my interventions. If you've got a much more risk and impact based system, you go, yeah, it's the migrants from this country, they're susceptible because of this, this, and this. Okay, we know what we've got to do. Or these people have been trafficked from one part of the country for exploitation to the other. This is how it works, because our risk process has identified this is a general theme going on. So we can start to put interventions in place much quicker. I talked to one company and they do traditional audit, and then they send in the deep dive when they find forced labor. By the time the forced deep dive is done, the contract has ended. They've moved on to the next contract and supplier. So no remedy ever happens. Yet all the team internally know the amount of money those workers are going to be paid on the next contract. They know how much goes on fees for recruitment fees, et cetera, et cetera. They know the issues. But the company doesn't want to change its compliance approach because it's embedded within its operations. And I think companies need to realize that's changing. Plausible deniability is no longer going to be a defense. It's no longer going to be credible. It is much more about a risk-based and impact-based looking at their supply chain. I would advise any company that finds forced labor, engage, engage, engage. What are the intentions of the cited entity? What help do they need? What is the form of forced labor? What's the severity and likelihood of harm? Can you remediate it? Companies will have a multiple of considerations going into this. And I won't go through them all, but it'll be, are they strategic? What is the cost, impact of disruption? Is there support available in civil society to help them? Did they cause it, contribute? What I would say is the more proactive ones tend to have strategic suppliers. They understand the issues and they can manage it much more effectively by preventing it in the first place happening. And this is this kind of iterative process of find, fix, and prevent. If you can get into that mindset and away from this very compliance driven, you're going to start to see success in this area that's going to be very credible and allows you to then present your strategy or your plans or what you've done with producers to government if need be, and it's credible.
Michael, thank you for that. I imagine that probably raised a few questions for folks. We have a couple more questions prepared, but that said, I'm conscious of the time, and maybe we've got one question in the chat now, so maybe we can take that question. If others have questions at this point, please feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we can transition back to our planned questions. So it looks like the question we've gotten so far is for you, Jen. If you could talk a little bit more about the specifics of how CBP traces supply chains and what tools they use.
I can't speak to the specifics of how CBP investigates and targets certain supply chains, but I think we can look at what types of tools are out and available. I think you've seen a real expansion of tools that became available about the time that UFLPA went into effect. A lot of companies started offering risk targeting and supply chain traceability products. And I'm not going to suggest one over another. Quite a few of them have very extensive capabilities. So if a country decides to contract with some of these risk-based platforms, they need to think about how they're going to operationalize the information that they receive and what type of threshold that this information needs to meet in order to apply it to a trade enforcement action. So let's say you've issued a trade enforcement action against a raw material that's deeply embedded in an upstream supply chain. You need to look at the risk or the likelihood that is being sold to buyers throughout the supply chain. And then what type of, as you get all this risk information, you need to think about how you're going to evaluate it. So let's say there's a medium risk that this raw material, let's say a critical mineral, is being sold to a downstream supplier, and you think the certainty of that is you have evidence that shows that they've bought from them before, but it's unclear whether they're still buying from them. It might not be enough to action on a trade enforcement, but it might be enough to request additional information from the importer to say, we'd like to understand what the supply chain is of this product that you are importing into our country. And then to build your understanding of that supply chain through those information requests. The question as well about targeting, that's even trickier to answer. But you do have to think about this from the standpoint that as much as you need to gather evidence about forced labor and the conditions to determine whether they're present, you also need to collect intelligence about how the supply chains are operating and who's buying from whom and who has a history of business relations, to think through then how that applies to the trade enforcement action. I would encourage countries to make sure that that's an ongoing process. If you have a trade enforcement action in place, you shouldn't just do that analysis at the time of issuance, because supply chains are so dynamic, and people change or companies change their list of buyers constantly. So that analysis needs to be ongoing as long as the trade enforcement action is in place.
Thanks, Jen. We have another question, which is, do you think there's appetite from the US government to offer technical assistance, either funding or expertise, to countries looking to implement forced labor legislation and enforcement infrastructure? Or are countries expected to figure this out on their own? And I will say, Marcy and I just completed drafting a report for Georgetown looking at child labor and forced child labor trade enforcement over the last 30 years. And from that, it was very clear that you have to have technical assistance alongside trade enforcement for it to be effective. You can't really delink those. But let me turn it over to so I'm biased, but let me turn it over to the panel for you all. I don't know who wants to go first.
I'll offer my 2 cents. Who's not biased? I completely agree. I think expecting countries to create the sorts of credible systems we're discussing just because someone sat across from a negotiating table from them and told them all their imports would become more expensive if they didn't do it is not a credible way to actually get to a good result. It is operationalizing leverage, which the Trump administration is very good at doing, but actually getting to the end result you're asking for requires some technical assistance and folks who know how to do this kind of stuff. I mean, the folks on this call, but the broader community. And so I do think technical assistance has to be part of the equation if we're serious about this. Whether the US government has an appetite for it, like which part of the US government, and what day is it? I feel like, the House is proposing zeroing out iLab's budget, right? Like we have the Doge. I can talk about whatever I want. I love this. The Doge cuts to the entire aid and international technical assistance portfolio. Like those have real ramifications, and so we'll see what happens in the midterms. We'll see what happens in the future, but I think that if they're really serious about this kind of stuff, technical assistance has to be part of the equation.
I think to add to Josh's point, it's unclear what the appetite of the U.S. government is in this area, and Josh brings up numerous important points. I think countries are certainly looking for this support, and if you think about what is being asked in terms of the trade enforcement recognition piece, if the U.S. government wants to see their trade enforcement actions replicated in other countries, and they are considering how this is going to, how countries are going to do this, they need to think not only about how they're going to actually issue them, but then what's going to happen when countries are asked to consider removing them, like the revocations and the modifications that I was talking about earlier. So, I mean, countries really need to be on the same page in terms of what are the standards, not only for issuance, but also then for removal. So, and that would require a lot of engagement. And I think technical cooperation would be key to that. And so, how the US goes about this will be critical to considering how that will be applied. Otherwise, it could turn into a mess if there's not a consistent application. No one wants to see 60 countries implement a flip, but implement them with a variation that requires the private sector then to go and put together a different compliance plan for each country. That is not helpful. So I think the technical cooperation would be key to trying to bring about that consistent approach. So I hope to see it.
The next question really builds on that, which is a critical factor for customs agencies in their interaction with organizations on the ground around the world to receive credible and detailed information. So I think this applies to each of you in terms of what's your view on how governments can create those trusting relationships, especially now when funding is scarce. Who wants to start?
Josh, go for it.
I think I used where the rubber hits the road last time, so I'll just say the proof is in the pudding this time. I think that you build credibility by showing people that you're credible. If you're showing up to affected communities and marginalized communities without building that credibility, they're not going to trust you for legitimate reasons. And so, I think what no one wants is to have people put their safety and potentially their lives at risk to provide information for a forced labor petition and then have that information not acted upon and potentially create increased risk for those communities without remedy. So I think it's not the only thing, but one thing is just showing that you mean what you say, and you're actually gonna enforce this law, and you're actually gonna press for remediation and try and make improvements in people's lives and get forced labor goods out of international trade. And I think once that is demonstrated, you are more likely to have credibility with these communities. So I think that's not the only part of the equation, but I think it's an important part of the equation.
Personally, I would say that the key to creating these types of relationships, just building on what Josh says, you have to follow up on you have to do what you say you're going to do. I think, though, that the question, you have to do that with a number of stakeholders. I think some people may be thinking, well, I need to create a cadre of labor inspectors who are going to go and interact with workers, or they're asking if they need to do that. And I would caution against that from a government perspective. I don't necessarily think government should be sending inspectors to other areas. And I think that's problematic for so many different reasons. But I'm going to focus in on one that just creates so much risk to workers who want to try and provide information, but who are under threat doing so. The threat of retaliation for workers that contribute to these petitions is great. And so I think instead, governments may want to think about how they establish relationships with organizations that have done work in this area. So civil society, trade unions, these are key organizations that countries should be trying to connect with and develop relationships with. Demonstrate to those groups that you have credibility, that you are not there to do harm, and then follow through on those actions. That's the way to establish a network of folks that are contributing to your process.
Can I just come in and reiterate that last point Jen made, because I think it's really important. I think and this relates to something Michael was saying too. I think the traditional approach of labor audits and basically taking a snapshot and saying, here's what I think the conditions are at a particular facility is not really giving you useful information in this context. What you really need, if you are a company or a buyer, is you need to have some sort of recurrent information loop that is sending you regular information. And so, whether it's through organizations, that are working on funding from a technical assistance standpoint, local grassroots groups, unions, those are the sorts of organizations that are going to be there in the long term and are going to be able to provide you with the sort of information that you're going to need.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
Just
Michael.
one further point on that, which is the more we focus on a company or enterprise level, the easier it is to see who is making the complaints, and the easier it is to intimidate or stop them. Much more effective is the sectorial level intervention, because it's very hard to then intimidate a whole sector. If you're looking at and also they tend to have champions, as Josh just said. It might be trade unions, it might be community leaders elsewhere who can vocalize some of these issues. So a big part, I believe, if you're going to make this a real change, is to move from the enterprise level often to a sectoral approach.
Thanks, Michael. And to Josh's point, we'll put a link in the chat, but CBP issued new guidance for importers a week or two ago that makes that exact point, that audits alone aren't enough and aren't going to they're giving you a snapshot in time and not looking at the recruitment and how the workers are treated. And it's how people live, right? It's not that hour that you're on, or, that chunk of time that you're in the workplace. And before we move on to the next question, I wondered, Michael, I know your experience has been more on the private sector side, if there's lessons learned from how companies build that trust, or if there's lessons learned from working with workers, what makes them feel comfortable reaching out to a government, if you have that perspective. Not directly, obviously, but.
I think it's been very, very clear what you're there for. It does take quite a bit of time to build trust. You're not just in there and go away. You are committed as a company to making change or preventing forced labor. We all know that if you're being audited, and I worked for a company where when we got audited, we knew exactly what to do to pass the audit because we had to, because that's what our business depended on, even though we knew things were wrong. The fundamental is engaging and trying to understand. Okay, you're not there to create jeopardy continually. You're there to understand so you can remedy a situation or help the producer, whoever it is, to change so they can sell more goods to you. So it's got to be a proactive approach. And once people understand that, they tend to open up, and workers also tend to open up because they're not being told to be quiet, because there's no jeopardy involved in the conversation. As soon as we include jeopardy into it on a commercial basis, everything changes. And once you start to build that relationship, then it's much easier to navigate it. I also think worker voice is a massive thing. We've got lots of tools out there. I would say that most of them are pretty useless. They're fantastic in the packaging, but in reality, they don't work. There's some very basic things on worker voice that needs to be put in place to allow people to phone to somebody or talk to somebody where they can express things without fear of retaliation or anything else. And it contributes to that information stream. But to do that, you need to be able to make change. Somebody phones up with a problem, you've got to solve it.
To chime in on that as well, if I could. Worker voice is now being used as a catch-all phrase to describe a lot of different tools that really aren't connected to credible and viable worker voice. Credible worker voice occurs when a worker is heard, and they are providing information, and there is follow-up to that. There is remedy for conditions that are consistent with forced labor or other violations of a company's code of conduct. And so if I think about what works better in the worker voice space, I think about how do you connect workers with people that they trust, organizations they trust, and individuals they trust? How do you connect them with those folks so that they can actually see an outcome based on the information that they provided, a credible outcome? And then how can you do that in a way so other workers see, oh, okay, that worker submitted a concern about, let's say, the food in the cafeteria, because that's a common one. They submitted a complaint, and it was addressed in a timely fashion. They remedied the concern right away, and everybody saw that it was handled. It was the outcome was credible. It was not just an outcome that no one was asking for, or an outcome that no one was thought really solved the problem. It was a common sense response to a complaint. They changed the food. They no longer served pork to largely Muslim workforce. They did pest management to make sure that there was a hygienic area for food prep. Whatever it is that the complaint that brought about the complaint, was to make sure that, yeah, they handled it. So then that's more likely to generate the next, and maybe complaint isn't the right word, the next concern. And they're going to get more credible and reliable information through that process. But the process, in my mind, needs to be community-based. It needs to connect, because those are the people on the ground that the workers are going to interact with on a consistent basis. That allows them to feel comfortable, and more comfortable than not to try and raise the concern. The greatest risk, I think, the companies are thinking through through this is, some companies think it's better if you don't surface the risk. They think it's better to hide it, it's better to conceal. That way I don't have to worry about this regulatory action, or I don't have to worry about the buyers coming in and telling me to take on an expensive remediation project. But instead, the greatest risk is the risk that goes unresolved. So you want those systems in place, and you don't want to just do a worker survey that doesn't lead to any kind of outcome. That's not true worker voice. So as you're thinking through as a company, I'm going to switch to companies instead of countries. As companies are thinking about how to mitigate their risk, it's really important to think through, how do you work with credible actors on the ground who have the trust of workers to bring about credible outcomes? That is the best way to mitigate your regulatory and reputational risk. And trying to obscure it through ineffective tools that are not fit for purpose, if they're not really getting to the point of remediation, then, or they're not really getting to the point of identifying the risk to begin with, then why put money into it? Because it's no longer, I think we're starting to see a shift. So many social responsibility organizations and agencies within companies have been focused on reputational risk, and that's still an acute risk for a company. But when you think about how CBP has enforced their and issued their trade enforcement actions, if you look at the historical data from this, you'll see that a lot of the companies that were issued against, they were doing those traditional social compliance audits. They were certified by X, Y, and Z organization. They were involved in lots of responsible sourcing programs. But if you're not getting to the nitty-gritty of actually addressing the problem, you're just spending a lot of money on things that aren't going to help you mitigate this regulatory risk. So if that's my pitch for better programming. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we have all the tools in the toolbox, the human rights due diligence toolbox that we need. There needs to be a lot more investment in these community-based approaches. And I'll be interested to see how this proceeds in the coming years as these flips become more prolific.
Thanks, Jen. That's such an important point, and I'm so happy that we got to worker voice. I'm not surprised, but I'm happy that we got there. There's one question left in the chat. We have just under 5 minutes. So maybe what I'll do is I'll pose that question, but also if there's anything you want to say in closing, or I know we didn't get to the last couple of questions that we had prepared ahead of time. If there's any points you want to make from that in 90 seconds or less. The question in the chat is, does, in your opinion, does USTR want to do a fair assessment of a country's efforts to adopt or implement an import ban? Or is it more of a one-size-fits-all approach that USTR is looking for? So if you want to make a comment about that and or any closing comments, who wants to start? Josh?
Yeah, I try to pause, but I feel like this one, hard to duck. So I'm biased to the extent that, I hired most of the people in the USTR labor office, and I believe in them, and I know they care about the issue to a person. So I think they are serious, and I think they are actually looking for countries to implement credible approaches within their own system. I don't think it's a one size fits all approach. Um, like you can look at the text of the agreements on reciprocal trade, as Jen mentioned, and some of those commitments are basically mimicking Section 307 actions. Some will be more independent investigations based on administrative capacity. You look at the credit countries got in the proposed rates. Someone like the EU, which has a fairly we'll see, how it actually shakes out, but has a fairly comprehensive approach on paper. They got the same rate as Bangladesh, who just said they would do it. So, I think that they are trying to meet countries where they're at, and I really do think the USTR Labor Office in particular is focused on making this an approach that addresses forced labor and supply chains in whatever way a country can do that. My closing remark, which is just a point I want to add that I haven't mentioned yet, and I think is something that folks should be thinking about. I think this is going to be not just a defensive space for companies, not just a space where companies are focused on compliance and all of the various things we've talked about trying to identify and root out and remediate forced labor in their supply chains for kind of defensive compliance reasons. This is also can be, and I think will be, an offensive space, right? There is a lot of focus, in the traditional trade remedies sense and more broadly on fair competition. And I think it is pretty well understood that if a company has forced labor in its supply chain or is using forced labor goods, that is not a basis for fair competition. And they are effectively receiving a financial subsidy, right? In terms of the wages that are being paid to workers and the working conditions that are being provided in that supply chain. So I think you should be thinking about this not just from a how do I get my shop in order, but also in a how do I make sure that I am competing on fair terms? And I think there are, this is something we do. There are real credible investigations that can be done into other companies to make sure they're playing by the same rules. And I think the scope of jurisdictions that will be hungry for that sort of information so they can act on it and lower their tariff rates is about to explode. So I would think about this both offensively and defensively if I was a company.
Thanks, Josh. I know we're at time, but Jen and Michael, last closing thoughts. And for anyone who has to jump early, we'll post the recording online in a couple of days.
Well, I'd just like to thank the Better Trade Collective for working with the Tendai Initiative to put this in place. I echo a lot of what Josh just said. I think that companies need to think about whether they're reacting to a trade enforcement action or whether they have the proactive programs in place to address risk very quickly. A reactive response is going to take a very long time to resolve, and it can be quite costly. So both suppliers and buyers in supply chains, and a lot of countries just became both. They're both trying to mitigate their own risk, but they're trying to mitigate risk in their supply chain. That's a big shift. So I think we need to think about how to assist companies that are in markets such as in any of the countries that are considering bringing a flip on board. They're thinking about HRDD in a way that addresses that dual risk of there's risk in my own operations, maybe not. How do I address it? But then how do I look at what's in my supply chain? think companies have been traditionally cascading these requirements down through their contractual arrangements, through their supply chain to say each company is responsible for doing this. I think as we move forward and see more of these flips come in place, we're going to see that that's had limited effectiveness. And so as those suppliers start thinking about their own responsibilities, that's going to be a huge shift. And so we need to think about what that looks like and what tools are in the toolbox for in an HRDD sense, and how they can address that in a meaningful way. I really want to thank everybody on the panel. I even learned things today. So I appreciate everyone's responses and want to thank you all.
Over to Mike.
Yeah, just I think companies should go away and look at whether process they've got in place or systems they've got in place are credible to meet this new regulatory environment. You know, will it prevent forced labor? Can you find it? Can you fix it? And it'll change the narrative. Very simple point, you know, when Sound Derby were cited, lots of other producers said, we don't have forced labor. It's a systemic issue in that sector. Why would they not have it? You know, we've got to open our eyes. It's not an enterprise level. It's often a sector because that's how they all compete. It's much wider. So open your eyes and go, why wouldn't they have it? You know, I work a lot with gender-based violence in Kenya, and a lot of producers say to me, we don't have it. And I say, well, why? How? Why? Everyone else has. Why do you not have it? And then the answer goes quite quiet because they haven't got the systems in place. They haven't got the knowledge. They haven't got the checks and balances. People don't have voice. Of course they've got it. And it's just a different way of looking at it. And it fits in with this rebuttable presumption. Mm-hmm. Prove to me you haven't got it if your sector's a high risk. Because the likelihood is you probably do. And I think this is great because I think hopefully we're going to see a change in the way this industry operates in human rights. Focus much more on solving problems rather than just trying to manage reputational risk, as Jen put it.
Thank you, Michael. It's a good note to end on. Thank you. A huge thanks to our panelists this morning. Thanks for your time and insights. I think this was a really great conversation. As I mentioned, we'll post the recording in a couple of days. We'll also, if this raised questions for anyone on the call, we'll share our contact information in a follow-up email. I think all of us are happy to answer any questions or have follow-on conversations. And I'd also just like to say on behalf of Better Trade Collective and also the Tendai Initiative, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.